Japanese farmers are making finished compost in 3 days. Not activating a slow pile. Not speeding it up from 8 weeks to 4. 3 days. From dead leaves to dark, biologically active compost that goes straight back into the bed. You've been composting for months, and your pile is still half broken down. Here's the reality. Your compost isn't slow because you're doing it wrong. It's slow because nobody told you what these farmers figured out centuries ago. The process isn't about heat or turning or carbon ratios. It's about what you pour on before decomposition starts. I'll show you exactly. Every weekend, gardener has some version of the same pile. It sits in a corner of the yard. A bin, a wire cage, a heap against the fence behind the shed. You have been adding to it for months. Kitchen scraps go in. Dead leaves go in. Grass clippings when you remember to add them. Coffee grounds because you read somewhere that nitrogen helps. You turn it occasionally. Maybe once a week if you are disciplined. Maybe once a month if you are honest with yourself. You have watered it when it looked dry. You have balanced the browns and greens because someone told you the ratio is what matters most, and it is still not finished. That pile has been sitting since spring. It is warm in the middle if you push your hand in, which means something is happening, which means you are not doing it completely wrong. But it has been 3 months, and the material still looks like half-rotted debris, not the dark, crumbly compost the gardening books describe. So you bought activator pellets from the garden center. You sprinkled them in, turned the pile, watered it again, and waited. And 2 weeks later, marginally better. Warmer in the center, darker on the edges. Still not finished. Here is the reality. Your compost is slow, not because of what you are adding or how often you are turning it. It is slow because of what is missing before decomposition even starts. You have been treating composting like a chemistry problem. Get the carbon to nitrogen ratio right, add moisture, maintain heat, wait for the reaction to complete. That is exactly what Western composting doctrine teaches. Browns and greens, moisture, airflow, patience. The instructions on every bag of compost activator reinforce the same framework. What all of it leaves out is the most important variable of all. Decomposition is not a chemical reaction. It is a biological process. See, the organic material in your pile does not break down because you achieved the right ratio or because the pile got hot enough. It breaks down because microorganisms eat it. Bacteria, fungi, actinomycetes, a whole succession of biological communities that move through dead organic matter in a specific sequence, each one conditioning the environment for the community that follows. The speed of your compost is determined by a single variable: how dense and how diverse that microbial population is at the exact moment decomposition begins. That is it. Everything else is secondary. Think about a forest floor. When trees drop leaves in autumn, those leaves do not sit in a pile for 6 months waiting to break down. Walk through any mature forest in early spring, and the previous autumn's leaf litter is largely gone, broken down, integrated into the soil layer beneath. Nothing turned that material. Nothing poured activator pellets on it. Nobody climbed through the forest balancing carbon to nitrogen ratios. The leaves decomposed quickly because the surface of every leaf that fell was already coated with living microorganisms the moment it hit the ground. The forest floor is biologically active at a density your backyard compost pile never gets close to reaching. That is why it happens in days, not months. Your pile starts cold and biologically sparse. The microorganisms that eventually colonize it have to arrive on their own, from surrounding soil particles, from the air, from whatever living plant material happened to end up in the bin alongside the dead stuff. That colonization process takes time. The population has to establish, diversify through multiple microbial communities, and reach a critical density where decomposition accelerates. That is why the process takes months. You are not starting with a biologically rich environment. You are starting with biologically inert material and waiting for life to find it on its own schedule, at its own pace, which has nothing to do with your planting calendar. Here is what most people miss about commercial compost activators. The products sold at garden centers contain enzymes and sometimes dormant bacterial spores preserved in powder form. They are not living microbial cultures. When you add that powder to your pile, you get a temporary enzymatic boost and a brief spike in microbial activity as dormant spores activate in the moisture. But there is no living population multiplying and spreading through the material. The effect fades within 1 to 2 weeks, which is exactly why your pile improved slightly after you added the activator and then slowed down again. You were not inoculating your pile with living biology. You were giving it a one-time injection of stabilized, mostly dead chemistry. Japanese small farm growers do not buy activators. They do not build elaborate turning systems or spend time obsessing over ratio calculations. What they do is inoculate dead plant material with something biologically alive at the exact moment decomposition begins. A dense living culture that colonizes leaves within hours and begins breaking them down immediately, not weeks or months later when the environment slowly becomes hospitable on its own. The difference in result is not small. Their leaves are unrecognizable as leaves within 72 hours. Yours are still structurally intact 3 months in. The liquid they pour is that culture. It costs nothing because it is made from materials every gardener already throws away: plant scraps, water, and time. It requires no special equipment and no purchased ingredients. It works not because of any exotic compound in the mix, but because of the living biology it carries. It delivers microbial density to dead organic matter at the moment it matters most, before decomposition has a chance to start slowly on its own. So the real question is not which browns to greens ratio produces the best outcome, or how often you should be turning your pile. The real question is this: why does decomposition in a healthy forest ecosystem happen in days? And what is the precise biological difference between that system and your backyard bin? That is what Japanese farmers figured out. It is what comes next. The liquid is called fermented plant juice. That is its plain name, and it does exactly what the name describes. You take fresh plant material, weeds pulled from the garden, kitchen scraps, grass clippings, the outer leaves of vegetables you trimmed before cooking, and you ferment them with a small amount of sugar, typically brown sugar or molasses, in a sealed container at room temperature. Within 48 to 72 hours, the material has undergone lacto-fermentation, the same biological process that produces yogurt and sauerkraut. What you end up with is a liquid dense with living lactobacillus bacteria, wild yeasts, and a range of naturally occurring enzymes that those organisms produce as metabolic byproducts. That liquid, all diluted with water and poured onto dead organic material, delivers a living microbial population directly to your compost before decomposition has even started. This is not a fertilizer. It does not contain significant quantities of nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium in plant-available form. That is not what it is for. Its function is inoculation, seeding dead organic material with the biological communities that make decomposition happen fast. When you pour fermented plant juice onto a pile of dead leaves, you are not feeding the pile. You are populating it. The difference in outcome is the difference between 3 days and 3 months. Here is what is happening in the hours after you apply it. The lactobacillus bacteria in the liquid are among the most aggressive decomposers in the biological spectrum. They produce lactic acid as a metabolic byproduct, which lowers the pH of the material they colonize. That acidic environment selects for further microbial diversity. Fungi and actinomycetes that thrive in slightly acidic conditions and specialize in breaking down the cellulose and lignin that make dead plant material structurally intact. Within the first 24 hours, that succession is already underway. The white thread-like structures you will see spreading across the surface of the pile by day 2 are fungal mycelium, the physical infrastructure of a decomposition network that is actively digesting the leaf tissue. By day 3, the leaf structure is collapsing because that network has already moved through it. Compare this to what happens in your pile when you add commercial activator pellets. Those pellets typically contain dried and powdered enzyme concentrates, sometimes with dormant bacterial spores mixed in. When you add them to a moist pile, the enzymes activate and produce a short burst of chemical breakdown. The dormant spores may germinate if conditions are right, but there is no living culture multiplying and colonizing the material. the enzyme activity exhausts itself within days. The spore germination produces a thin, dispersed population that takes weeks to reach the density needed for rapid decomposition. That is why your pile showed improvement and then stalled. You gave it chemistry. Fermented plant juice gives the pile life. Here is what most people miss about the biology of rapid decomposition. Speed does not come from heat management. It does not come from turning frequency. It does not come from achieving a precise carbon-to-nitrogen ratio, though ratio does matter for final compost quality. Speed comes from starting with a sufficiently dense and diverse microbial population. When that population is present at inoculation, decomposition does not have to wait for colonization. It begins immediately. The succession from bacteria to fungi to actinomycetes that normally takes months in a cold, biologically sparse pile happens in days because all three communities are introduced simultaneously, and the conditions the bacteria create, acidic, moist, enzyme-rich, accelerate the establishment of the communities that follow. Japanese small farm growers and practitioners of Korean natural farming who use nearly identical methods have understood this principle for generations. They do not use the term microbial inoculation. They describe it as giving life to dead material, which is a more accurate description of what actually happens than most of the technical language Western composting literature uses. The science has caught up with the observation. What they were doing empirically is precisely what microbiologists now describe as accelerated microbial succession driven by inoculation density. The mechanism is specific and observable. It is not folklore. Now let's talk about what the finished product actually is, because this is where the gap between this method and your current system becomes expensive in a way most people have not calculated. The compost that comes out of a fermented plant juice process after 3 days is not the same biological material as the compost that comes out of a slow pile after 3 months. Both are dark and earthy. Both will improve soil structure. But the 3-day product is still biologically active, teeming with living microbial communities at high density. The 3-month product has passed through those microbial communities and come out the other side as stabilized humus, which is chemically stable and structurally beneficial, but largely biologically inert by the time you apply it. When you dig stabilized compost into your bed, you are adding structure and some slow-release nutrients. When you apply freshly fermented compost, you are transplanting a living ecosystem into your soil. That distinction matters because the organisms in the fresh material do not stop working when they hit your garden bed. They continue colonizing the surrounding soil, extending fungal networks, cycling nutrients, and building the microbial diversity that determines how fast your plants grow. The compost becomes an inoculant for the entire bed, not just an amendment. One application starts a biological process that compounds over weeks. That is why Japanese beds produce yields that Western gardeners, applying bagged compost on the same schedule, cannot replicate. They are not just adding organic matter. They are continuously transplanting living biology back into the soil every time they compost. Here is what that means for the system you are currently running. Every slow compost cycle you complete is an opportunity cost. The material finishes biologically inert. The fertility it represents was available to your garden weeks or months earlier. The living microbial community that could have colonized your beds and built lasting soil health was consumed by the decomposition process itself before the compost ever reached your plants. You exported living biology into a slow pile and got stable chemistry back. That is the cycle. It is worth understanding before we talk about how to stop it. Walk into a bamboo grove in Japan and look at the ground. Bamboo is one of the fastest growing plants on Earth, producing dense quantities of leaf litter continuously throughout the year. That litter disappears. There is no months-long accumulation building up underfoot. The floor stays clean, not because anyone rakes it, but because the biological activity on that forest floor processes dead material as fast as it falls. The same principle operates in every mature ecosystem. Dead organic matter does not pile up because living systems have the microbial density to handle it in real time. Your garden does not have that density. Your compost pile does not have it either. That is the entire problem, And it is fixable. Think about what this means for the cycle you are currently running. You grow plants that build their structure from soil nutrients. You harvest those plants. You pull out the spent material and move it to a pile somewhere else in the yard. The pile sits for 3 months, depleting itself biologically while it waits for enough microbial colonization to complete decomposition. You apply the finished compost to your beds, get a temporary improvement in soil structure, and then watch plant growth slow again as the living biology you needed was never there to begin with. Then you start over. The fertility never compounds. The soil never gets persistently richer. You are running a flat cycle, not a building one. Japanese small farm growers run a different cycle entirely. They apply living compost, not stabilized humus. The microbial populations in that fresh material continue working in the bed after application. They colonize the surrounding soil, extend fungal networks, and increase the biological activity of the entire bed. The next batch of plant material that goes into the compost pile carries a richer microbial population than the batch before. The compost finishes faster. The finished product is more biologically active. The beds get richer with each cycle rather than staying flat. That compounding effect is why their yields increase over time while yours plateau. I know what you are thinking. You do not have a bamboo grove. You have a backyard bin, or raised beds, or maybe just containers on a patio. You do not know whether you have the right plant material, the right equipment, or the right climate to produce fermented plant juice. Here is the reality. Any green plant material works. Any dead leaf material works. Any container with a lid works. The fermentation happens on its own. You are not managing a complex process. You are starting one. The only 3 ingredients are fresh plant scraps, brown sugar or molasses, and water. Here is exactly how to make it. Fill a container, a bucket, a jar, a bin, about halfway with fresh plant material. In kitchen vegetable scraps work. Grass clippings work. Weeds pulled from the garden work. The outer leaves of vegetables you trimmed before cooking work. Add 1 part brown sugar or molasses for every 3 parts plant material by rough weight. Pack the material down. Add just enough water to keep it moist but not submerged, and seal the container. Leave it at room temperature, out of direct sunlight, for 48 to 72 hours. By day 2, you will see the confirmation. White mycelium threading across the surface of the material. A sweet, earthy smell. Not rotting, not sharp, but fermented, the way good yogurt smells. The culture is active and alive. On day 3, drain the liquid and dilute it at 1 part liquid to 20 parts water. Pour that diluted liquid over whatever dead material you want to compost. Leaves, spent crop residue, or dried grass. Keep the pile moist and covered. In 3 days, the material will be unrecognizable. You do not have to dismantle your existing setup to do this. Add the liquid as a single step to what you are already doing. Pour it on the pile you already have in the corner of your yard. Watch what happens over the next 72 hours compared to what has been happening for the past 3 months. That single comparison will tell you everything. Once you see the difference, integrate it fully. Every time you have plant scraps, run a fresh batch. Every time you add material to your compost, inoculate it at the start. Every time you harvest a crop and drop the residue back into the bed, spray it with diluted liquid before you turn it into the soil. The biological activity in your beds builds continuously rather than depending on stabilized amendments you buy in bags. That is the shift. You stop treating compost as a batch product you make once and apply once. You start treating biological inoculation as a continuous practice woven into every stage of growing: planting, pruning, harvesting, replanting. Each cycle feeds the next. The soil does not reset between seasons. It builds. The Japanese farmers who developed this method were not microbiologists. They did not have laboratory equipment or access to academic literature. They observed what a forest floor does, and they copied it. They took the biological richness of a naturally active decomposition system and found a way to reproduce it in a container from kitchen scraps and sugar. The mechanism is now fully described in soil science. What they were doing empirically for centuries is what microbiologists now call accelerated microbial succession through inoculation. They called it giving life to dead leaves. You can do exactly the same thing this weekend. You do not need new equipment. You do not need purchased inputs. You need plant scraps you were going to throw away. And 3 days. Your compost pile will never run the same way again.